We'll cover the main obstacles and options for connecting to data, and look at a real-world example using the Federal Reserve's API and Power BI. Welcome, friends and foes, to another Data Devotional, this time on accessing data. I'm Luciano Pesci, the founder and CEO of Emperitas and Nexum. Today's devotional is dedicated to data access. 2 weeks ago, I put out this poll on LinkedIn asking what were the main areas where people were struggling with data. The crowd was obviously very clear that accessing and cleaning was their main bottleneck. We're going to divide this up into multiple devotionals, covering the access component today and the cleaning component in an upcoming devotional. Empowering employees to access data is a growing problem within all brands, but the democratization of data is inevitable. Brands who are digging in their heels are going to suffer because competitors are going to exploit inefficiencies that are visible in data that the other brand is just not paying attention to. Getting access to new data or expanding the data visibility that you presently have is a difficult task, but it's one that's aided by knowing how to go about it the right way. One of the most obvious places to start is who controls access versus who can grant access. In some brands, that's going to be the same individual or the same team. But the bigger the brand, the more likely these tasks have been bifurcated. So you may have to go through the group that controls data governance to get authorization, but then turn to the group that controls access in order to get it granted. I collectively group all of these individuals into what I call data guardians. These can be DBAs, IT members, directors, those who are sitting on the data governance board, but understanding who has the power to authorize versus who has the power to actually grant access is important. You will have to go through both steps. And if data governance exists in your brand, you should start with that group. While this is a difficult problem to solve, it can be done with a mix of these two types of skills. Soft skills, meaning getting the attention and the support of the data guardians, which can be the hardest part. And then the hard skills, which is speaking their language. And this is where, if you put in the most time, you're going to see the most results. You do not have to become an expert in everything related to databasing and access management. But if you can speak their language, if you can put your request in terms that they understand, that signals to them that you are serious and that your request is worth following up on. Here is a worked example where you can just insert the pieces of what you're requesting into this text. I need read-only access. Usually you do not need write access. So just right there, expressing that you only need read access shows them that you're not going to be able to take down the entire database by accident. You should also be able to list specific tables and fields that you're after, narrowing the request for the data down to only what's important. If time ranges and other filters are involved, you should pass that along from the beginning. A concise but clear request in the terms that the data guardians understand will go very far in helping you get access to the data that you want. Let's connect the problem of data access to the obstacles and options that you will face. I already mentioned access management. This is what you're going to the data guardians for. Just like submitting a request in a language that they can understand, being clear about the components that you are after will also help. And these typically are user credentials. Sometimes you also have to whitelist your IP address if you want to access a database, which means you're going to have to find your IP address, and it likely changes on a recurring basis, and then submit that to the data guardians. Visibility permissions. You may have access to a table, but not all the fields. You may not have access to all rows. There can be additional security layers that are in place that stop you from seeing what you need, even within the system that you can access. And then there's the shelf life. How long will this access last? Most data guardians have protocols in place to revoke access after a specific period of time. Knowing that will help you prepare for when those transitions are going to happen if you need to continue accessing that data. Depending on the tech stack that your organization is running, these requests can be very complicated to fulfill or very easy to fulfill. I asked again recently on LinkedIn, which of the two primary tech stacks are people and brands tied to? I suspected that Microsoft was going to dominate. I did not expect that 65% of individuals are using Microsoft products, though about half of those are also using Google products. If you are using the Microsoft stack, then Entra ID is a fast track for data access through Power BI to databases, either on Azure Cloud or on some on-premise Microsoft-based server system. This is the primary set of obstacles that you're going to face in trying to get access to data. Let's talk about the various forms of data that are available to you to use once you have access to a system. We'll start with flat files. These are typically files that you can open in Excel, and I'm going to expand this definition slightly to include XML and JSON files. I know they are not technically flat files, but they are a single file that you need to then deal with. And many tools like Power BI can ingest them just like they can ingest an Excel file format or a CSV. I'm also going to include PDFs under this description. PDFs are not flat files by definition, but what you're after is the structured information that they contain. And as we showed in last week's data devotional dedicated to Looney data and the Canadian chart visualization mistakes, We learned that it's very easy to pull in structured data from a PDF through Power BI. Flat files are your first go-to for a few reasons. You can use them to compare the data that you're going to get through the other access channels that we'll discuss in a moment, but they're also usually the fastest path to data. And if you have a login to a tool like a SaaS tool or an online platform, a web app, usually there's a way to export data from that application, and it will typically be in one of these file formats. These files might be coming to you in email. You can download them, put them into a folder, and then put them into the same data pipelines that we're going to talk about throughout the rest of this devotional. But flat files are your friend. Find them and use them wherever possible. But automating them can be difficult. If you have to move the file from an email to a folder, that's an additional step. What if you can just access the data in the database itself? This is where being very clear about whether you need read or write permission is a first step. By default, rarely do you need to write back to the system. Most of the time, what you're trying to do is access the system to pull the data out and into some local environment where you're going to analyze it. This is usually done with a SQL-based language, and this is a different set of skills than Excel. Beyond the SQL programming language itself, if you're working with a database, you really need to understand the data origin story. This includes the schemas and table keys, whether there are slowly changing dimensions involved. Is there a data dictionary that you can look at for the definitions so that you can create appropriate joins across tables? And what is the refresh schedule of the data in the database? All of those will inform how you interact with the database and the analytical insights that you produce as a result. Databases are internal tools. Very rarely will you have direct access to an external database. Instead, if it is an external data source, there will be an API layer put on top of that database. This application programming interface allows you to interact with the data. Again, you may have read or write permissions. But the data itself is often a secondary consideration. The API is usually there so that that software tool can interact with other software tools. But this can provide a backdoor to third-party data in an automated fashion. Just like with the other forms of data access, you're going to have credentials. This usually comes in the form of a key or secrets. Like with a database, you're going to have to understand the way in which to structure your request for information and the way that a response will be provided, which often requires additional transformations or parsing. But APIs are a great option for automating third-party data source to target transfers. And that data will end up in your database, where you're back to needing SQL or a tool like Power BI to directly connect to access it. Well, let's solve the data access problem with a real example. Using the Federal Reserve's API, we will not have a database as the intermediary. We're just going to connect directly from Power BI to the API using a Python script. All of this has been made available online. You can go to the slides, which are in the comments for this video, or you can send me a message. This slide in particular has 4 sources on it. It has a link to the Federal Reserve. That's the image you're seeing here, and I'm about to bring that up full screen. It has a link to the Python script, single Python script, very simple. Uses the Fred API package in Python. There is a link to the active live Power BI version of the dashboard that is connected to 13 of the data sets on the Federal Reserve's API. And then there is a link to the PBIX file itself so that you can continue to add additional data sources using the same Python script. What is FRED and why are we using it? FRED is the St. Louis Fed's economic data set containing time series information on more than 100 macroeconomic metrics. So this is the same thing measured, usually monthly, going back in time often to the 1950s or 60s, but sometimes further. We're using this data for Silvermint, specifically to model the environment that the agent-based simulation is taking place within. So rather than have the tokenomics of that model be simulated in just a random environment over the next 50 clicks, which is the time periods that that model utilizes, we're forecasting the likely real macroeconomic environment utilizing a subset of these metrics. The Federal Reserve has an API which they have made available to the public. All you need is a key. The script uses my key. You're welcome to continue to use that for small personal use. But if you're going to put this data into real production, please get your own account and key. It takes less than 10 minutes. Right up there in the upper right, it says my account. You can get in there, get access to a key, swap it out in the script, and be up and running for yourself. The quality of an API is directly related to its documentation. And in the case of the Federal Reserve, they've got a pretty good one. You can go and read the documentation here. It walks you through how to access the system, how to structure your requests, and what the response will be like. Not all APIs are as good as this one. Oftentimes, documentation will be out of date, and it makes it very hard to deal with interacting with the system. You have to guess and test. But even without an API key, you have access to some of this data in flat file format. So if we go to the series themselves, you can search any series by these categories on the Federal Reserve's website. You do not have to connect via API to download the data. So for example, let's go in and look at population. I can get any of these series in monthly, annual, quarterly. I'm going to say monthly. Let's look at population. I can set dates. It looks like it defaulted to the earliest date in this case on the series, which is 1959. It's defaulted to probably the last data collection, which was August of 2023. I can modify this graph here, or I can download the data directly using this download link. As I said earlier, with flat files, usually if you have access to the platform, there is a way to export the data in a flat file format. But we're here for the API, and we'll need 2 bits of information from this page in order to make our request work. The first is the series number, and then we're going to use the title as we label it in Power BI. So let's switch to Power BI now. This is the PBIX file that you can download using the link on the slide deck. It has these series, 13 of them, I believe, already added. I'm going to show you how to add one more. You can come and look at these individually yourself if you like. You can play with them. They're all editable here. So you can use any of these fields. You can go into the table view, look at any of them individually. You can look at the model view. None of them are connected because we could connect on date for some of them, but they have been imported as individual data sources. Let's go back to the report view and let's add another series to the dashboard. In order to do that, we're going to get data and we're going to more, then we're going to other and Python script. This is going to open a window that allows me to paste in a Python script. I'm going to back out of this for a moment to show you something that's necessary. Power BI is going to use the version of Python that you have installed on your machine. So you need to come in here into the options and check under Python scripting. If you want to do this in R, you can do something very similar in R. In fact, the origin of this scripting, we should give credit where credit is due. These data sets were initially discovered by Ryan Weiser. Ben Peterson created the first API connection in R to the Fred API. And then Hector Munoz has transformed that into the Python script that you can download using the link in the slide deck. You will have to pip install the Fred API package in Python, but once you have that set up, this script will run. So I'm coming back to the model view, get data, more, other, Python script. Here's the script, download it onto my machine. You can see my API key. Should you get your own, that's where you would replace it. We're going to replace the series in this area. And then rather than confidence indicator, which is a placeholder that we're going to use to label the column, we're going to name that after the population. So we're going to go back to our Fred, get this value. We're going to swap the series number here, done. And we're going to replace this here with population. Get rid of that hanging R, looks good. Now we have our script, let's paste it in, hit OK. That Python script will run. Power BI is connecting to the Federal Reserve API using my key. You'll see the table that's going to show up that we can select. Here it is. We've got the date and we've got the column we named population. This looks fine. We're going to transform it just so that we can, one more time, use the series ID using Power Query to transform this by naming it. We'll hit save and close. And we have a new data set. We can see it over here. We can add this, add a line chart. I like to go full screen whenever I'm doing EDA. We're going to use the sum of population and the date, and there we are. And we'll name this page after the series. I could save this and publish it to the Power BI service, and that would update the live dashboard that you can access with one of the links on the slides. I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to allow you to add whatever data that you'd like and publish it to your own workspace. If you want to share it with me, I'd love to give you some feedback on what you've done. But that's how simple it can be to connect to an API using a script to get third-party data that you bring into your environment. We could set up this automatically so the API data is flowing like it does for Silvermint into a database. And then once in that database, we could utilize it, transform it, parse it, do all the things that we need to use in forecasting the macroeconomic environment that Silvermint will face in the coming years. So one more time, here are all the relevant links for you to utilize the script, PBIX file itself, so that you can add additional series like I just did. If you just want to play with the dashboard on the front end, here's the live link. Keep your data progress going by practicing pulling API data through the Federal Reserve using that Python script in the Power BI file. And we'll dig into EDA around flat files and database querying through SQL in many of the upcoming devotionals. See you at the next one.